Hey, good morning, folks in DC. Good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in the Middle East. Welcome to this roundtable on the future of the global automotive and mobility value chain. My name is Anil Khurana. I'm a professor at Georgetown, joined about 6 months ago, and also oversee the Baratta Center for Global Business, which is hosting this roundtable. Till recently, until about a year ago, I was actually the managing partner for PwC's global industrial automotive mobility business. And I carried that interest into this discussion as well, which of course is part of the Baratta Center now. And just as a brief background, the Baratta Center was set up 6 months ago as a series of discussions on global business at Georgetown and the McDonough School of Business over the years led to the Baratta Center. Joe Baratta is the managing director at Blackstone. And he, the dean, Ricardo Ernst, who's a professor, and I kind of designed the notion of studying global business. And so the focus is, how does future of global business look like? And in particular, connecting business, government, and society on a series of issues, topics, challenges. And the connection, of course, is that faculty and students at Georgetown would continue to connect with these stakeholders, business, government, and society, with the intent of addressing and solving some of these major problems that we see. It's in that context we had a conference in October 2nd, where we looked at themes like globalization, cross-border investing, global value chains, technology, AI, and a few other issues around trade and politics. And one of the outcomes of that was a series of roundtables. This is one of several that we'll do in the rest of the year. And so this one is focused on global value chains, with a focus on automotive and mobility. We have a tremendous panel today. And before I kick off the panel, what I'd like to say is I'm actually in Dubai and spent the last 2-3 days at COP28. Clearly a milestone COP in the sense that there are a lot of expectations and need for commitments. There's a lot of discussion on sustainable financing. Clearly, money is important in getting some of the initiatives, the energy transitions, the green premium gaps, the developing countries going. So along with that, energy goals, is a key thing. There's still ongoing discussions and negotiations on country commitments, which are clearly one of the key elements that'll move governments and countries forward. But there's an overall sense that more needs to be done, and more needs to be done in both commitments, but also semblance of a plan. So individual country plans aren't enough. And so how do we connect industries, public-private sectors, and investors and companies, and so on and so forth? So I think that's the flavor of what the COP28 has been. I'm sure you're reading in the news, but that's, I think, what we'll see in a week or so, as well as a summary. Lots achieved, lots to do. And it's in that context that I think we have this panel as well. Before I go to the panel, I want to actually just mention to the audience online. So I think we have maybe 100 or so folks online, that if there are any questions, please put that in the chat, Q&A. A couple of our team members are monitoring that. And then, of course, in the room, there's a few dozen folks there. You can use the mic to ask questions as we go along. Let me ask the panel to introduce themselves briefly, and let me start with folks that are in DC. So I see Rahul Gupta, Chris Davey, and David Etzweiler there. So I don't know, why don't we start brief introductions, keep it too short, and we'll do a detailed one later on. So I'll let you start. Who wants to go first?
Thank you, Anil. Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to be here. Thank you to Georgetown University McDonough School of Business. Rahul Gupta, I'm currently the North America leader for infrastructure mobility at Accenture. 20 years in private consulting, PRTM, PwC, Deloitte, Accenture. Anil and I go back to PRTM, PwC days, and the first 15 years in the US government. I've always operated at the intersection of technology, innovation, and transformation. And I believe this is one of the biggest shifts that we're going to be facing, both in terms of energy and mobility. And then I'll address some of the basic facts behind where we are and how we have entered the valley of despair, and potentially how do we get out of it. So thank you.
Chris Davey, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary over at the Department of State. I'm in the Bureau of Energy Resources. I run the Energy Transformation Office. And we see, as much as the comment there was made, true, we're behind, but I see nothing but positive in front of us, in part because why is the Department of State here? This is a whole of government effort. Have you seen Department of Energy? Have you seen Department of Defense? Of course, the White House. But this is a whole of government effort. The State Department is leading a program called the Mineral Security Partnership. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but basically it's 14 partner governments, over 50% of global GDP, all working to basically, what I like to say our MO is get as much product, critical mineral product, out of the ground and process it or recycle it and get it to the market from the most diversified sources with high ESG standards or environmental, societal, and governmental standards. And we do this with our partners and primarily, and the biggest focus, I'm really glad about this, is with the private sector. And a huge emphasis is working with the private sector. And so as you saw in COP, there's a lot of announcements. One of the good things we're really happy to hear is the fossil fuel industry is there and they are making commitments. They are part of the solution if we want to reach our goals. For those who are business students, this is the place to be. And so I really like to thank the Baratta Center here at the McDonough School of Business. But this is the future. This is where if you want to be employed, make a difference and make a lot of money, this is where it is. But you will make a difference and you will change the world. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everybody. David Utzweiler, CEO of the Siemens Foundation. Siemens Foundation is the corporate foundation of Siemens USA. We focus on equity. Our approach to equity for the last 10 years has always been through workforce development, really driving that as yet unfulfilled American dream, where if you work hard and you set plans for yourself and your family and your community, that you should be able to provide for that. Our involvement today, I think, is really around the electric vehicle charging sector. We recently announced a $30 million 10-year initiative to drive inclusive workforce development in the electric vehicle charging sector, specifically manufacturing, installation, and servicing of chargers. One of the things that we know as these investments are being rolled out over the next 10 years, these federal investments are being rolled out over the next 10 years, is that there's no way that we do it if our workforce approach and our workforce looks the same as it has been. Absent marginalized communities and women being enticed, being recruited and invited into those sectors, we're just not going to get our environmental, our economic, our national security interests and objectives solved. So that's where we're pushing really hard.
Thanks, David. So for the panelists online, let me suggest we go alphabetical last name. So that'll be a bit of a tongue twister maybe. But Alan, why don't you start? Short introduction, sure. And then we'll go to Richard and so on.
Sure. Thank you, Anil. My name is Alan Amici. I'm the president and CEO for the Center of Automotive Research, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Prior to joining the center, I had a 30-year career at Chrysler, primarily in product development, where I was the head of electrical engineering. And then later I was the head of Global Uconnect, which was Chrysler's infotainment and connected car platform. So really happy to be here with you, Anil, and the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Richard?
Anil and the speakers and participants, very happy to be with you. I'm from Paris today. My name is Richard Bouvray. I'm the CEO and chairman of Blue Solutions. I'm participating as a small contributors to the change by doing and manufacturing since 12 years batteries, but new technology of battery, what we call solid state batteries, on 2 continents, in Europe and in North of America. And I'm very happy to be there with you today to discuss about the value chain for the transformation of what I call electrifications, but I would say that it should be larger than that.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome. Eugene?
Hi, Eugene Moore here from Apple Green Electric. I'm the CEO. 12 years in leadership positions in Apple Green. I hate to admit it, but I'm not 32. So there was a few years prior to that doing property and construction and food and beverage and retail and whatnot. Apple Green Electric is a subset of Apple Green, one of the largest travel plaza and motorway service area operators in the Northeast US and Europe. Probably one of the companies you never heard of, but if you're traveling from Boston to Buffalo or from New York to Chicago or from Maine to Delaware, you've probably pulled in at a travel plaza and had some of our services. So happy to be here. We're developing a contiguous network of EV fast charging across the Northeast US. We trade as Welcome Break in the UK, and some of the people in the UK would be familiar with that brand name, and obviously in Ireland as well. So in scale terms, in terms of EV CPOs, we'd probably be similar in scale to EVgo by volume. However, with a much smaller amount of chargers, because our throughput per charger is multiples of a typical CPO, given our locations on either an interstate network or a strategic road network or a national road network. You can get into the details of that later on, but hopefully that's enough to give you a flavor of what I'm up to.
Thank you, Gene. Fedra?
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or evening to you, Anil. My name is Fedra Ribeiro. I work in the mobility space for 25 years. The last around 15 in the energy transition space, different roles in different companies. Today, I'll focus a little bit on the charging infrastructure transition, and I'm very glad to have this exchange with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fedra. Dave, you're up next, please.
Thank you. Hi, good day, everybody. David Roberts, based in the UK. As you can see from my face, 40 odd years in the automotive sector, built lots and lots of ICE vehicles, millions of them at Chrysler, performance vehicles at Aston Martin. I lead a number of companies today, from Fusion Energy in California, all the way through to auto parts company, going through the transition to zero emission vehicles. Also lead an OEM in the truck business that's a pure EV hydrogen play here in Europe. So a lot of experience across the patch in terms of automotive, both in the supply chain, but also in the OEM. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion on the transition as we move to zero emission vehicles.
Thank you, Dave. Laura, connect us, please. You're the expert.
Sure. I'm Laura Schul. My entire career since college has been in vehicle electrification, so 18 years. I started at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a think tank in Colorado, on our electrification team. Then I worked at the FERC and was the first analyst fully focused on vehicle electrification from the energy regulatory perspective. But I am here today because I'm the CEO of Streetlight Data and founder. Streetlight is a technology firm that analyzes a huge amount of data that are coming off of things that move, so connected cars, connected trucks, smartphones, doing a ton of data science, analytics, machine learning to turn that into useful contextual information to help all sorts of transportation decisions get made, including lots of site selection and planning for vehicle electrification, as well as many other sorts of infrastructure decisions. So Streetlight has been around 13 years, and 2 years ago, almost, we were acquired by Jacobs Engineering Group, which is a very large 66,000 person engineering firm that is actually building a lot of the core infrastructure, the roads themselves, as well as the connectivity and some of the core infrastructure that supports charging and other forms of decarbonization in the transportation space. And I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome. So I think the first slide that you probably see on the screen, and I can't see it, is the classic automotive value chain. You know, many years ago when I was doing a PhD in Michigan, one of the things we were learning at that time was the auto industry, you know, took 100 years to build and was mature. And there's a concept called clock speed, which said this industry now moves pretty slowly. This industry now is faced by a series of challenges, of course. You know, the transition to mobility, EVs, hydrogen, and all of that is putting pressure on this industry in terms of the pace of change. I think we've been talking of the industry changing, and the pace of change is just picking up. And this industry, I think, is under pressure to innovate fast, to transition fast. And in fact, some of the key themes that are coming up is, can the EV industry move fast enough with the portfolio of vehicles, build the charging infrastructure, innovate on batteries, and at the same time, find a way to be profitable. This is a $4 trillion industry. So it's not a small one, and it's actually going through major transitions of multiple countries, I'd say dozens of countries around the world, employs 15 million people, are all going to transition in many ways. So, you see some of the text in blue, supply chains changing. I think David talked about the skills need to change. All the automotive OEMs and the Teslas of the world, the pure EV players, including David's Teva and all, are having to invest big time to make this transition. Affordability is a key theme, whether that be in terms of just cost or range, which is another topic that comes up and on the next page. The sales model is changing, so dealerships and how do we go to market is changing. So several things changing in the existing auto industry. But then you go to the new EV or zero emission vehicle value chain. And again, it looks different. So there's no tier 1, tier 2 suppliers anymore. It actually looks a little less linear, more fragmented. So raw materials, mining, I think Chris talked about some of that. Many Albemarle and many other players in that business. Battery cell production, Korea, China, big in that. Clearly components like electric motors and other EV components, in terms of control systems and all are required before you have an electric vehicle. The EV sales model is changing. Customers buy, but they're looking at rebates and even leasing models and various other aspects. Charging becomes a key constraint or key enabler for eliminating range or charge anxiety, as Rahul says. And so business models are emerging as well. And Chris, if you click once more, this is also linked to then after sales. What do you do with the battery when it's done with? What do you do with the components? Because the whole theme is around sustainability. You can't be throwing components, into landfills. You can't be tossing batteries into garbage. How do you actually recycle all of them? And Chris, if we click once again, some of the themes that come up are, I think Chris talked about critical minerals, lithium and cobalt and nickel. David Roberts talked about the supply chain in terms of electric components. Not the classic suppliers aren't necessarily ready. I think Richard will talk about battery design and performance. The footprint in terms of carbon, are we sure we actually have the right value chain to deliver net zero or negative carbon footprint for the electric vehicle over its lifetime? I think measurements are still happening. It's become a software industry as well. I think as some of the players in the industry finding out developing software for a mechanical engineering company isn't easy. And then, governments around the world, I think Chris mentioned some of that, where incentives in the US, the IRA, incentives in UK, Germany, India, across the world are now beginning to create the shift from simply cost of ownership to cost of ownership, including the incentives, the regulatory and the tax benefits that come as well. I was talking, a few months ago with some of the after sales folks, and they're saying, wow, we don't even know how to deal with the maintenance cycles or the replacement cycle. We don't have enough history. So skills and capacity for servicing are going to change. And as we said earlier, charging, and Federa's going to talk about that, amongst others, are becoming an important aspect as well. Is there enough charging infrastructure? I think Laura mentioned that as well. Home charging versus fast charging, and all those questions that come up in this process. So we're going through a rapid change in the industry, and in some ways the questions are the very similar question that COP28 is dealing with. How do we make this transition in a reasonable time period? How do we create the financial viability to make this work? And how do the different players in the whole ecosystem, the whole value chain, actually come together? And right now it is, fragmented efforts across the world. And we'll touch upon some of these issues in the next hour and a half as well. David, if I can actually ask you, given your extensive experience, 40 years across the different, I'd say, versions of the auto industry, what do you see in terms of the readiness of automotive OEMs, whether that be in Europe or the US, to make this transition?
So thank you, Anil. So I think OEMs are all at different levels of readiness in terms of the transition. And just, I'm sure we're all aware of it, but if you are the CEO of any OEM today, whether it's General Motors or Ford, whether it's Aston Martin or Lamborghini, whether it's Caterpillar or JCB, you have a number of bet the ranch questions to answer here on this transition, because it is absolutely coming, and it's right, it is coming for the planet and for global warming. But what are we to do here for OEMs? And I'm going to talk a little bit about Jaguar Land Rover, which is very close to me. But in terms of a board, you've got to decide which, am I going battery? If I am going battery, which battery am I going with? Which chemistry? What's the form factor? Is it going to be an integral part of the vehicle? Is it going to be external to the vehicle so I can swap and change as things develop? If I'm going hydrogen, what am I doing? Am I doing fuel cell or am I doing engine? Do I have the infrastructure around me to get that right? What about e-fuels? Will they come through and make a late burst on technology later on? How do I deal with infrastructure? How do I deal with, for example, in the UK, we have 8, and I'll say it again, 8 hydrogen refueling stations in the whole of the country. We don't have one high voltage charger for trucks in the whole of the UK yet. So infrastructure is a big issue, as well as the whole chemistry of, am I going battery, am I going hybrid, am I going hydrogen with it? What am I to do here? I'm also building a plan here that is very China-centric. Most things go through China in connection with a battery, whether we like it or not. So am I building a whole infrastructure and a strategy around a reliance on China? And if I'm not doing that, where's the billions coming from and the time frame to catch up with China in terms of supply, key materials and key battery technologies? So these are major issues I've got to deal with. Above all else, I've got to make sure my supply chain comes with me. So let's just talk a little bit about one particular program called EMA. So Jaguar Land Rover, on their reimagined strategy, are launching EMA, which is a whole range of Range Rover electric vehicles. And there is what we call Job 1, a date of kickoff, which is coming up in 2 years' time. JLR have got to be sure all their suppliers for all the batteries, all the motors, all the compact EDUs, all the paraphernalia, the software, the apps, all the stuff that goes with it, all the infrastructure and charging, whether it's residential or commercial, all turn up at the same time in a sequenced manner. Now, compounding that is most of the supply chain has to reinvent itself, as I'm doing with 3 of our auto parts companies. That involves a big ticket investment. It's thick end of $100 million in one particular company's case. I do. I'm betting that JLR turn up on time, and more importantly, that the other suppliers who are critical turn up on time, so we have a successful launch. Now, if you look at the history of launches, whether it's Ford, General Motors, all the way down to Aston, most of them are tricky. And that's with an ICE engine that's got a lot of maturity and reliance. So when you then overlay on top of that a complete new technology with a slightly different sales channel of going direct to consumer rather than through the traditional dealership approach, you can see these are very high profile stakes. JLR's investing billions, every OEM is investing billions in the transition, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions. So there's no silver bullet here, and that's a fact. There is going to be a lot of localization, there's going to be success stories, and I think, like in all good manufacturing stories over the last 200 years, you look at the best examples and you go replicate it. And I think that's the way this will evolve as we go forward. So I think it's an incredibly challenging journey. We used to say in the supply chain market that the supply chain was about 3,000 miles long and about 6 inches deep. The supply chain's gone to 1,000 miles long and it's now 1/4 of an inch deep. That's the fragility of supporting our OEMs. So we need some help. We need help from governments. It would be really great to have a uniform approach across the planet, but we're not going to get that. And so politicians may come and politicians may go, and there may be a slightly different emphasis on the transition period. All of these things impact confidence. All of these things impact investment decisions. All of these things impact sorting out global warming. And behind all that, the clock is ticking every year remorselessly. This planet gets warmer. You can argue about the reasons for that, but it's a fact. This planet gets warmer every year, and emissions are a big part of that problem. So we have to fix emissions. But fixing it, Anil, I think is a lot more challenging than we believe here. And so I think we've got to be ready for some disappointments, and I think we've got to be ready to be frustrated, particularly with certain other countries. But I think that doesn't stop the effort. We've got to get there. We've got to, by 2050, we've got to be at net zero. We have to be for the sake of the generations to come behind us.
Thanks, Dave. Alan, I think you have some US data to back up what I think Dave just described. And just for the audience, while we do that, I think we have only a few slides that we'll present today, and the rest will actually be available to all the attendees by email after the roundtable is over today.
Okay, thank you, Anil. If you could please advance to slide number 2. So I'd like to share with you just a sample of some of the data, some of the research that we do at the Center for Automotive Research. What you see in front of you are announcements, so investment announcements from automakers in North America between 2009 and year to date, 2023. So these are global automakers, but it's investment targeted or announced for North America. And you can see there's 2 colors in the column of the bars there. The dark colors, or the black, is investment in ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles, and the light blue would be investment in EVs or EV battery production. And so you can see the early part of the decade, again, starting in 2009, was primarily primarily investment in ICE. Again, this is product and facilities as well. And you start to see some investment in EVs around 2019. And of course, 2020 was pandemic year. 2021, you saw some advancement in investments, but it really took off in 2022. And if you look at both 2022 and 2023, this is $98 billion, with a B, billion dollars of investment in North America for EV and EV batteries just in the past 2 years. It's an incredible amount of investment. And you can see, looking back over 20 years, how just the last 2 years have dwarfed investment, altogether. But there's another interesting aspect. If you zoom out a little bit, you'll see these peaks that are occurring. There's a peak at 2011, 2015, 2019 peak investments. Those are UAW contract years. So that's labor negotiation years. And so if we look forward to today, 2023, we see a peak at 2022. That was not a labor contract year. In fact, this year is. And this data is through the end of October of this year. The expectation is 2023 will again peak. It will exceed the 2022 announcement. So all of the ramifications from the labor contract and the investment hasn't completely been compiled and is well understood yet, but we'd expect to see a peak there. So incredible investment. And we use this as our crystal ball. So these are long-term capital investments. And this is going to play out over the next 15 and 20 years. And this is a very difficult aircraft carrier to turn around. So I think it's clear that EVs are going to be a big part of the future here. This is also used by suppliers as a risk assessment. So companies that are presently making piston rings, they can look at this and see that there's an incredible amount of investment going into EVs, and they may want to start their pivot or start thinking about a pivot. It also is a confidence builder for those that are manufacturing or will be manufacturing EV components. If you go ahead to the next and final slide we have. It's very similar data. Again, this is automaker announced investment in North America, but we break it down a little bit. You can see that Canada, so primarily Windsor and Ontario region, about 14% of investment has gone to Canada. You'll see a little bit more than 7% has been in Mexico, and the remaining 77% has been in North America, in the United States, excuse me. So primarily US focused, but certainly considerable investment in Canada and in Mexico. And then if you take a breakdown of the table to the left, you'll see that approximately 45% of that investment is in the Great Lakes region, so Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, but also Windsor, Ontario as well. And then about 58% or 55% in the southeastern United States. So of course, this is Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. We also include Texas in there to make the mathematics kind of manageable. So considerable investment in the southeastern United States, but certainly also in the Midwest. Thank you, Anil. Back to you.
Thanks, Alan, for that overview. Chris, we go to next page, and then I'd like to invite Fedra, who wanted to update us on Europe and especially the charging value chain. Fedra?
So, but while Chris transitions the slide, charging happens in 3 moments of the usage of your, in this case, electric vehicle. At home, which today is still the majority of the user time, 90% plus. Then on the road, usually where you have public charging and fast charging as well as ultra fast charging, and at destination, again, public charging or in companies. Sorry, Chris, it did not change yet. I'm happy to keep going. Okay, the one before, yes. So access to home charging in markets like in Europe is limited, as most people live in urban centers, big buildings. So sharing of EV charging infrastructure proves hard. At the end of 2022, there were 2.7 million public charging points worldwide, estimate, which is a significant growth from the previous year. And what we see is continued growth of public charging infrastructure globally in all regions. So if you go to the next one, some major trends happening, like the colleagues before was saying, there is the need to move towards standardization of technology. OEMs are developing their own charging networks with advantages and disadvantages because it leads to fragmentation, at the same time leads to increased availability. Some networks are opening up, so are in the phase after, where they're opening up to public usage. Partnerships are accelerating, so companies are realizing, or players are realizing, that traditional and emerging charging infrastructure players should partner in order to scale faster. Long-term capital entering the charging space, so there is a lot of funds making large investments in Europe. You have the example of BlackRock and Ionity. There are a number of others. And there are the first signs of consolidation of this infrastructure, which is in Europe extremely fragmented, in North America, let's say, fragmented in comparison. So if you move to the next slide. So the last slide shows you, focused in Europe, how fragmented the landscape really is. So we have the disadvantage of country regulations, incentives are not harmonized, and also depending on where the OEM is headquartered, a certain technology or a certain type of partnership scales versus what is happening in other countries. So the landscape in Europe is very fragmented. There are very regionalized operators, and we expect in the next 2 to 5 years a start of a consolidation to occur. One last remark I would make is to feed the aspirational targets for 2030 electrification, we also need to discuss how we produce energy, because the energy today is not enough to source all the vehicles on the road. So charging infrastructure continues to be an extreme challenge for the net zero transition in Europe and globally. Thank you.
Thanks, Fedra. And we'll come back to some of these topics in the panel discussion as we proceed further. But I want to give Rahul Gupta an opportunity to describe the mobility transition at a broader, complete, holistic level. So Rahul, there's a slide that you have that is going to be quite integrating, I would say. So on to you.
Thank you. This slide tried to bring together some of the conversation you just heard from the internal combustion engine and all of the infrastructure that was built over the last 125 years, and tries to portray what is going to require to get to a public park. So today, every OEM and every supplier behind the OEM effectively has optimized for a particular channel. So as we look at the legacy transportation system, it's worth about $1.3 trillion. It employs about 13 million people. And as we just heard from David and others, that you are moving towards a condition that is bringing into question what is required for that transition. So we're going to go from a self-contained system to pretty much an open system. We're going from a car that's built with a very resilient supply chain to a ecosystem that is going to be today semi-connected. You just heard from Fedra that you've got different OEMs that are building different standards to optimize what they know of their particular sales channel. But the one piece that's missing from here is the fact that we need to move towards a resilient supply chain. And for the very first time in transportation, we're dealing with different industries coming together. So if I were just to ask you, how many gas stations are there in the United States? It's a really tough question to ask because most people don't usually pay attention to it, but it's absolutely critical. If you want a car, you don't worry about it. It varies between 120 and 175,000 depending on who you ask. Well, how many gas pumps is that? Well, you probably don't worry about it because you see it in one corner station. It's a little bit less than 1 million gas pumps. Now, if I were to ask you, have you heard of range anxiety? And I think it's a misnomer. It should really be charging anxiety because now you're going to be looking for a charging station. And it's not 8 minutes you're going to spend at a gas station. You're going to be spending anything between 20 minutes to a few hours. So how many EV plugs would we need? Well, it varies from somewhere between 28 million at home to about 2 million on the public road, of which 150,000 should be level 3 and the rest would be level 2. It makes a difference. Now, let's talk about what does a software-defined vehicle mean? It means that that car now is going to tell you it needs juice. You're moving from dyno juice to electrons. As you start moving forward, you have to worry about what is car telling me? I don't see a gas station. Now you're going to move towards a data collaborative. What does that mean? It means public sector and private sector coming together to generate a new value chain. And looking forward to hearing from Siemens on how do you make it happen. Now it's a system-centered approach. And as we can see, the demand for EVs is on the downturn. That is the value of despair. Everybody who wanted to buy an EV, who could afford an EV, which has gone from 66,000 average to 59,000, which is very expensive when the median income, one of the professors told me about $72,000 in the United States. Try to live to $72,000 in the United States. So you're going to go through the value of despair and how do we bring it up? And I think the way you bring it up is to create data and insight marketplace. You have to give confidence to both the public sector and to the private sector that this infrastructure is going to work. But for the very first time, as you see on the right side, you need to harmonize. I would go beyond standard. I think standards is one thing that works for everyone. Harmonization means multiple things that can talk to each other and work for many people. And that value chain that you see in the middle, as it spread across for the very first time in the automotive value chain, is going to touch industry sectors that were not engaged in decision-making. You need to worry about the road. Well, maybe there's innovation that we haven't talked about. There are 3 OEMs working on hydrogen, white hydrogen or green hydrogen. They want to keep the internal combustion engine going. Well, what happens if we can make a breakthrough in hydrogen? Maybe you don't need to go full EV. Maybe there is a situation where either the power generation or the car itself has some kind of combustion engine, but the combustion engine itself, the source is green. The second thing that happens is that if you make a pure EV car and trucks, they weigh about 30% more and sometimes 40% more. So battery technology is going to be key. The road today is not built to take that weight. All of a sudden, you have to worry how you build that road. So we're talking about a number of activities that need to happen between 2023 and 2035, which completely changes the way we think about transportation mobility. And so you're going to go from walled garden, and we want to go to public parks, where everything talks to everything in order to generate for the freight, the supply chain logistics market, the ability to deliver products and services. And when you think about that, the minerals and the metals that go into that value chain are totally different. And when we talk about rare minerals, it doesn't mean they are rare. It's just their particular qualitative attributes are quite unique. So you need to talk about where does that material come from if we do make that shift. And then eventually get into a system of systems and to a data state. So transforming the mobility ecosystem is probably the biggest change that we are facing, because it is about 6% of our GDP. It's about 6% of our workforce. And this is what makes the United States and Europe unique compared to every other country. We can get anything we want when we want. How many of you used to 2-hour delivery? That's because of the mobility ecosystem that we have. And that is the challenge of our time. And having worked on infrastructure in the government since 1993, I can tell you that we, for some of us, have been waiting for a long time for the investment for the United States to get to the 21st and to the 22nd century. So it's exciting at the same time, but we want to walk in with the eyes wide open, because the utility, the transportation, the infrastructure, the planning, the zoning, the construction, everything that you see closer to the public parks is still under construction. Thank you. Back to you, Anil.
Thanks, Rahul. So I think we've, in the last 3-4 presentations, which is just a sampling of the history or the legacy of the auto industry to the future of the mobility industry. Now let's dig a little deeper. Rahul, in one of your remarks, you mentioned that the EV sector is in a valley of despair. The folks that wanted to buy them have already bought them, and until the prices drop, it's not going to be a big uptick. Well, that may change, or that may vary around the world. But let me ask the core auto folks here, and there are several of those, Dave, Alan. If you're an auto OEM today, and Alan, you actually work with many of them. Dave, you are one, you were one. How do you address this gap in a way? You've got to keep your existing portfolio of ICE vehicles going. You've got to bring down the prices of electric vehicles, otherwise affordability becomes an issue, and you cannot always depend on incentives alone to fill the gap. So between the question around affordability and the capital needed to adjust the portfolio, what are your views? I don't know, Dave, you want to start first? You're on mute, Dave.
Thanks, Anil. I think affordability has got to go with another word called profitability. And that's what we're all juggling here. So how do we make an industry that's profitable? Because we've enjoyed very good profits over the last 25 years in particular, with the global boom of automotive cars in the world. How do we make it affordable? Now, typically, you'd look at scale economies and you'd look at scale. Typically, we all talk about the bigger the scale, the bigger the batch, the lower the cost, bang, bang, better profits, lower cost. However, it's a bit more challenging in a nascent industry that's still finding its feet, for example. And it's also a nascent industry in the charging, which is not insignificant. So if I just talk a little bit about trucks as an example, and they produce, just so you know, more emissions than combined with marine and aviation haulage industry in this planet. I'm going to pay, I'll put it in US dollars because it may be easier, although I pay about, say, 25,000 US dollars for a 150 kilowatt charger, I'll pay almost $1 million for a 2.5 meg charger. So that's a significant cost, and it's an upfront cost as well, because with no charger, I don't have a truck that can do EV. So this affordability, in theory, gets played out, and there's a lot of predictions around 2030 that the EVs come down. China plays a significant part in affordability because there's a whole range of Chinese EV companies who are now looking to expand globally, and they're certainly coming into the European market, and they are certainly one of the more affordable EVs you will find on this planet. So if I take SIAC and MG, they bought the MG brand and they rebadged Shanghai Automotive with the MG banner. That's one of the most popular selling EV cars in the UK today. And its reason is it's the lowest cost EV you can buy. And it's a pretty good quality build, and it works pretty well for a lot of people. So China will undoubtedly globally drive down the cost of EV vehicles. Now, whether OEMs can then find profitability, and the only way they find profitability is scale, and the only way they find scale is to reduce the prices and hope they can sell the capacity they've created in their plants. And of course, we all know in automotive, getting that plant at optimum utilization is key. It's a heavy fixed cost side, an OEM facility. So you've got to put the throughput through it. You don't put the throughput through it, your break even's in a pretty bad place. So I think the challenge of affordability, with China coming over the horizon with a range of very good value EV cars, driving down that, plus profitability to repay the billions you've got to invest on this journey. In a way, Anil, I'm glad I'm no longer involved on boards of major car OEMs, because that's a really tough call. It's a tremendously difficult call to make in this world. Alan, we'd welcome your thoughts on it as well.
Thank you, Dave. So I agree with your assessment. What is keeping CEOs up at night, automotive CEOs, is two things: affordability and profitability, certainly. I think, again, 110-year auto industry, we're probably in year 5 or 6 of EVs, realistically. So again, a nascent industry, there are many cycles of learning that are going to occur in the EV space. And that's going to come through optimization of designs. It'll come through productivity enhancements in the plants. I think an example, so one of the ways to tackle the the affordability of cars, we've got to address the cost side, of course. An example, pre-pandemic, around 2017, a Tesla Model S had approximately a 90 kilowatt hour battery times $200 per kilowatt hour, which was the cost of batteries at that time. So the simple math says that's an $18,000 battery. Okay. In the auto industry, engineers work very hard to take 50 cents and $1 out of a car by finding, innovative solutions, weight reduction, other combining 2-for-1 features. The notion that you can take $9,000 out of a car, this post-pandemic cost of an EV battery is approximately $100 per kilowatt hour. So that same Tesla Model S battery, 90 kilowatt hours, is now $9,000. So I think the key to reducing cost for EVs is going to focus on that batteries. And there's a couple of areas, as you mentioned, is the productivity. We're going to learn how to build batteries more efficiently and effectively. Cell construction and cell chemistry, are there less expensive ways to get a highly dense, energy dense battery to market? These are really the keys. The rest of the vehicle is primarily the same. I don't see any significant changes to the cabin or the interior or the chassis components. Those certainly had to be upgraded to handle the additional weight. But I think the key to affordability is the innovation that really needs to occur, primarily in batteries. There is one other aspect, and then I'll pause and yell. There are other aspects like electric motors. So electric motors have been around since Tesla, and they're also 100+ years old. I think you're going to see terrific innovation in that space when the auto industry engineers are focused on how do you make electric motors smaller and lighter? Are there different frames and stators that can be used, different technologies, better winding technology that can take some of the weight out? So I look for innovation to come up with clever ways of reducing the cost of EVs. I think the question will be is how quickly can that occur? And there's some challenges. So there may be some incentives from the governments to help reduce the cost of EVs. But I look to innovation to reduce the cost of EVs.
Thanks, Alan. Richard's on the call as well, on the panel as well. Richard, I
Yeah.
think straight to the topic. Batteries, critical part of the value chain that's emerging, critical part to OEMs and new EV makers' profitability. What are you doing to enable that, and how do you see that picture emerging over the next, let's say, decade?
Yeah, first of all, with some data, what we can say that, if you take a vehicle today and even in the future, when we are thinking about cost, let's say that the bill of material of a vehicle, it's between 20 to 40% of the vehicle will be the battery. And he's the battery today. Now that being said, of course, we have seen in the past 10 years the cost of the battery going down, even though there is a big peak of increase on raw materials. To make battery, if you think about the battery with lithium ion, or lithium metal, you will have lithium inside. And in the same time, you will use a cathode that will be in phosphate iron, for the cheap one. And maybe what will be the future, that the trend we are seeing now, or we'll use a cathode in nickel, cobalt, manganese, and that which represent, let's say, 45% of the cost of the battery. So that's clear that today, if we are not able to manage well the full supply chain from the raw material to the design, will be very difficult to decrease the price of the battery. In the same time, of course, there is a scale effect. You see that everywhere popping up many what we call gigafactories. Then volumes is built step by step, mainly by Asian maker today, because they are all focused on lithium ion technology. I would say what we call the old technology, but which will be the dominant one until 2035, certainly. And it's obvious that I would say that, and I confirm what has been said, the affordability of the car will be directly linked to the battery. How we can move on that, So a battery is material, and it's also added value with electronics on it. It's at the end, it depends if you think about battery for, if you have a vehicle that is a tool, or if it's a vehicle for pleasure. We were speaking about Jaguar Land Rover. When you buy a Jaguar Land Rover, most of the time you buy a car that has a soul. And, sometimes you are ready to pay a bit more money. What you want at the end, you want quality, performance, but at the end, you want pleasure. But if you think about commercial vehicles, they are machines. Or if you think about very, I would say, small car, economic, affordable cars that people need just to go from A to B, that would be purely the cost that will be drive that. So after technology will come on battery, I will not explain there and make a lot of, big, I would say, a story about the technology on batteries, but there is a huge different type of technology that is already coming, that is already affordable today, and they are fully driven by the profile of usage. If you need a car that is making 100 kilometers per day, then we will use the sodium batteries. If you need a car that has to make 1,000 kilometers in one shot, then no choice than to go to lithium metal. I think that, and the cost will be there. So then we, of course, and after we will have hybrid batteries, we will use sodium, we will use lithium metal, and it will depend. You want energy or you want power. It will be a decision for people. And there will be a big, I would say, question mark. What will be the battery of the future? Just something to move the car? or something where you will be able to collect the energy for your home as well, you know, inside the grid. What it will be, a damper for the grid or not. So we are working on it. And to close my speak now, you know, I think that the biggest point will be the ability to manage and control the supply chain on mining and refining. If we can do that, the impact will be absolutely tremendous. Today we see that just for example, if you take graphite, only China is managing that. And the price are not linked to the cost. The price and the power is not on the automotive makers, the power and the raw material supplier today. Okay, so this is something that we need to control better, that we need to anticipate per each region in the world, Europe, North of America, Asia, and maybe being able to work more better together on that in holistic manner.
Thank you, Richard. There's actually a bunch of questions in the audience, but before we go there, Dave, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Sorry, Anil. Thank you for that, Richard. That was great. I just wanted to give two observations on affordability. The Jaguar I-Pace was their only EV car JLR launched. It's coming to the end of its life in 2024. And it's kind of at the 3,500 to 4,000 cycle stage on that battery, which was BMW technology. If you kind of look at the replacement of that battery pack, excuse me, if you look at the replacement of that battery pack, it's coming in at about $40,000 US. Now, if I have to replace a V8, it's nowhere near $40,000. So actually that Richard, that cycle time of the battery, that longevity of that battery, which comes down to usage and so on, and temperature and one or two other things, that's also going to be a critical cost factor in affordability, because if a consumer's facing a bill for that battery change in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years, that's a significant cost. It's also a significant cost to any financing arrangements you may have with a third-party financier. The second observation, Anil, on affordability is the insurance cost of a vehicle, whether it's a passenger vehicle or a truck, is about double the cost of an equivalent ICE car. That's significant for a consumer, but actually when you're looking at a truck, it takes it from $4,000 a year per truck to about £8,000 a year for a truck. And in wafer-thin margins in last mile transport, these are costs that really matter to them. So affordability is not just about the unit cost of the vehicle, it's about some other longer term costs that come with owning a battery vehicle.
And assume, Dave, those costs come down.
One point, Anil, just to bounce back on that, it's very important. Yeah, it's fully linked to a global cost. It's more holistic, and what we should not forget today that most of the car makers, they make money with the after sales. You know, there is a great potential for them to make money on the traditional vehicles, and this business model is completely modified with electrical vehicles. If you have a very, I would say, affordable EV, when you arrive at the end of the life, it's more or less, there is quite no chance that you will spend a huge amount of money for a battery that is more or less the cost of a new car. Okay, so it's something that we have to integrate. And in the same time, the parts that you have to change in the vehicle with EV is quite limited. So the opportunity for I would say, for the OEM to make money with after sales is also reduced. So it's something to integrate in the business model.
Thank you, Richard and Dave. Can I just switch gears and ask Chris to weigh in on the whole question of minerals and costs? And actually, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A chat as well on that. So Chris, on to you for a brief overview on that.
Sure, thank you, I appreciate that. And as you can hear the conversation, it is complex. But what you're hearing is a common theme, though, is, well, what are governments doing about this? And we are developing a partnership with the private sector in this. We need to have a partnership, and we need to help in terms of this nascent industry to actually flourish. And are we behind the power curve? Yes, of course. But are we trying to jumpstart it, to use a pun? Absolutely. How we're doing that is through a variety of legislative acts, as you've seen, past one being the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS Act for semiconductors. But one of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, under the Biden-Harris administration, really has set a stage, really has changed the dynamics globally. And what I mean by that is, you know, prior to the passage of the IRA, I would be in overseas at an embassy, or we were pushing on international delegations about how we really need to go and push and advance a clean energy transition. And so, yes, industries were doing it. As you saw in those charts, there's some investments that were going in there. But what had happened was most of my counterparts, interlocutors, would say to me, whether it was in Europe, whether in the Americas, whether it was in Africa, whether it was in the Indo-Pacific, well, you're not doing enough. You need to do more, United States. And so we passed the IRA. And what happens? Oh, wait a minute, you did too much. Well, that was a little too much. What I mean by that was they were not expecting that. Nobody was expecting that, because this is the largest investment in clean energy transition, the largest investment in terms of EVs that the United States has ever made in history. It's huge. And what it is doing is it's a catalyzing effect, because it's not just simply government money just thrown at a problem. It is catalyzing the private sector to be a force multiplier to increase those investments. So just to give you an example, with some of just since the IRA has passed, just a little over a year ago or so, over $140 billion from private sector has already was put into the market. Over $140 billion. This is the U.S. market. And over 71 in clean energy manufacturing. So these legislative acts are changing the dynamic, are helping the industry, and we're continuing to do that. We have programs through the Department of Energy and also through the Department of Defense that are really trying to catalyze that private sector investment and help them basically jumpstart this industry in a manner that's going to be sustainable. Now, this is not an easy, just you pass a bill and that's it. It is continual work. We are working day in, day out, not only here in the United States, because we understand that the domestic market alone from a critical mineral supply chain is not enough. This is a global solution, not only from just the resource, the raw materials that we need from globally, not only to fuel the United States, but also the global energy transition. But also there's a global solution in terms of how do we work with partners. So with respect to, from the State Department standpoint, as I mentioned earlier about this mineral security partnership, so we were working day in, day out on trying to find minerals, secure those minerals, develop those minerals, a term called beneficiation. How do we upscale industry? How do we upscale those jobs also in those developing markets that don't want to be seen just as an extractive country? They actually want to create their own industry, and we want to support that effort. We want to upscale that industry, not only so it's just extracting the minerals that some of our competitors just do, but actually developing the processing alongside those mines, and also focusing on recycling. So we're looking at those three areas, again, extraction, processing, and recycling. But we're looking at this in terms of how do we do this globally? And then how are the initiatives we're doing together, and how we work together to not only, as we have our own country interest in this, but how do we foster this new, what we call frontier technology? Because as it was stated here, it is innovation, affordability and profitability, and those are the two key themes here. So how does industry, how does the government help do that? So we've had, many of you, the moonshot, we've had the sunshot, you know, these are the big initiatives that we put in. Now we're running into in the EV market. How are we looking at investing in those innovative technologies that is going to reduce the cost so everybody can afford these EVs? I was just at a benchmark conference a couple of weeks ago in Los Angeles, and it was very clear in terms of where the focus is. So we need to secure our supply chains, but we need to reduce the inputs into these cars so we can make it affordable, and then not only for the cars, but in terms of the charging stations. And so you'll see a lot of technologies that'll be focused. We're looking at technologies from a Department of Energy standpoint, also from a Department of Defense standpoint, in terms of what we can invest in so we can achieve that. And we look at this in terms of, or the way I look at it, in terms of a 2030 kind of hash mark, where what are we trying to do before 2030 and what are we trying to do post 2030? When we say post 2030, that doesn't mean, oh, we're going to wait till 2030. It's what do we do in investing now that gets us the results post 2030? Because right now everybody's talking about LFP batteries, LFMP batteries. But then what's the future? Is the future lithium sulfur batteries, which requires a lot less of these minerals, which makes it a lot easier in terms of supplying these EVs. Are OEMs going to do vertical integrated markets, or are they going to continue with their suppliers? How are they going to be affected by export controls from competitors, which, as of December 1, it was initiated from China on graphite controls? How do we then respond to that? And how do we work with our OEMs? How do we work with industry to help resolve this and expedite this process so that we can meet our goals? So our goal by 2030, as you probably have seen, is 50% of new car sales are EVs. I mean, that's a goal, it's a vision. But what we're doing every day is trying to work and understand and work with our partnerships with the private sector to understand what are their needs so that then we can respond to those and then look a little bit farther down the road so we can meet those targets. So it is a whole government effort in terms of what are we doing domestically, but it's also a global effort in terms of how do we meet this, because the electrification, and one of the key things that was mentioned briefly, but I would like to underscore this, are the grids. We cannot electrify unless you invest into the grid technology. So even in the United States, I mean, if you want to look at the Achilles heel, the grid technology, upgrading the grids to basically electrify, this transition is going to be one of the key investments that are going to be needed, not only in the United States, but globally to meet this. I mean, it's the power infrastructure and how do you carbon neutral the power sector. So there's a lot of opportunities here, especially in the business world, and the innovation in STEM, et cetera. But just a final note is it's a partnership. It's the partnership with the private sector, and it's a partnership with our like-minded allies to try to achieve these objectives. Thank you.
Hey, Chris, a question came up in the chat. Thought I'll share that with you before I go to David for some views on the investment in people. The question was essentially what you talking about limitations from China, the IRA setting up battery facilities in the US. Is that going to lead to some increases in costs? It's a trade-off, right? So some costs go up as you limit the value chain to local and under IRA requirements and so on. How do you see the trade-off between making batteries, in this case, related to minerals, affordable, while managing the supply chains to be reliable from a US perspective?
One of the analogies I like to give is basically just looking at, if you were going to invest just in the stock market, and are you going to put all your money in one stock and just, wish it's going to be, that's the stock, that's the winner? Probably not. Everybody has a diversified, or most people have a diversified portfolio. That's the same thing we look at, is diversity and competition lowers costs along with innovation. And so what we're looking at is how do we lower this cost? Right now, everybody's tied to, in some of these minerals, to one country. But by diversifying and lowering costs and increasing innovation, I think that diversity alone will help reduce costs. But also, more importantly, and this is a lot of people are forgetting this fact, is these OEMs have to look at their supply chains. They have to secure those supply chains. It's very concerning, or disconcerting, I should say, that when all of a sudden you see an export control on a certain mineral that you desperately need, why wouldn't you want to diversify away? So when you look at this, that actually reduces the risk, reduces the cost overall in terms of that diversification message of how we look and invest abroad, whether it's here in the United States, but also taking advantage of our critical mineral agreements and also through the IRA tax incentives and 30D tax incentives. These are all incentives to, quote, help lower the costs, particularly here in the United States.
Thanks, Chris. David, if we can, David Etzweiler, that is, if we can go to you. All of this is a big demand on the skills and capabilities of people. The UAW in Europe, similar thing. What's your observation regarding, skills needed, how ready we are, what sort of jobs might be created or lost as well?
So there's an enormous skill shortage around this planet.
So, sorry, David, this was to David Etzweiler. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, no problem.
Yeah, I'll come to you as well. My apologies.
No
Two Davids here.
No worries. Thanks, Anil. Look, I mean, we are hyper-focused in the Siemens Foundation on workforce, and the reason that we're focus there is because we know over the next 10 years, the 3 federal pieces of legislation, the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, we know that some 17 million infrastructure-related jobs will come online during that time frame. We know that some 15 million infrastructure-related workers will move offline during that same time. And in order to solve these issues around the environment, national security, economic opportunity, we've got to do things very differently. And so within those job categories, we're focused on the electrical vehicle charging sector. So like I said, hyper focused, but we're doing that because we looked at the data of what those jobs pay. We looked at the sustainability of those. Those jobs are going to be around for long after folks in the room are off the planet in all likelihood in some form. And the opportunities are fantastic. What we know is that equity is no longer just the right thing to do and a nice thing to do. It's the only thing to do to move forward as business leaders and for society. The folks that are right now involved in as electricians are disproportionately older white men. That demographic is in decline in terms of the opportunities to recruit and retain folks there. Women represent something, I haven't looked at the figures in a while, but it's something in the neighborhood of 4% of electricians. I mean, it's tiny. And marginalized communities do much less. So even if you have a cold stone heart for equity, and there are folks who do have a cold stone heart for equity, you have to understand that it is a business imperative. And so we're working with partners in the initiative that we launched, Everyone Charging Forward. We're working with partners who are forming partnerships in Detroit with EVITP and a group called MUST and IBEW. They have a track record, a proven track record of recruiting from marginalized communities, with women, and they understand sort of what the supports are for different communities. So those are things like affordable housing, those are things like transportation and childcare. These are things that the business community for a long time has kind of resisted and said, well, we think that's kind of a government thing to do. It's an imperative now. And so we've got to form these partnerships across cities and states, federal government, business, academia. We have to have a different approach if we're going to move forward. So I think that's one of the lessons. And you know, again, we're hyper-focused, but I think across all of this problem solving, the states and cities that are forming those broad partnerships are really out ahead. One of the partnerships that we have is with North Carolina Business Community for Education. That's a group that's a nonprofit that's been housed in the governor's office for 40 years. And they're working across labor, business, academia, and many others to really set the strategy, in this case, for electric vehicle charging. Where are we going to need the chargers? How many do we need? Where will we need the workforce? What community colleges and technical schools do we have? What are the apprenticeship programs? What are the legal obstacles that we need to have removed in our policies? Those are the places that when we took a pretty deep dive and looked at the research, we really found, you know, some sectors, some parts of the geography in the U.S. that are doing that well and are beginning to lead, and others that are falling behind. And I think in very short order, we'll start to see the differences there, but embracing that, and I think from a business perspective, understanding it's a different time, right? You really have to invest in longer term relationships with some of these other sectors and figure out very quickly who gets it done and who doesn't get it done. That's where we're really funding and pushing forward really quickly.
If I could follow up with that, totally agree, and I'll give you a direct case study. And we like to think in terms of case study. If you can illustrate and justify a business case that has both a social ROI and a financial ROI, I think you can make the case that you can scale to other communities. So we're working in South Florida, Broward County, with another not-for-profit, moving on, where we've taken a zip code and we want to elevate that zip code through the Justice 40 program to enable that community to commute using sustainable mobility from that zip code to the place of work. And there's a business case to be made. which means you have to create a sustainable corridor, which means you have to have electrification, which means you need to have the skill sets, which means you actually have to put the policies and the processes in place. And it is built on the concept that sustainable mobility is also how you empower economically. But to have that value chain exist, you have to touch all of the elements that for the very first time, you can address some of those issues that you created with the dino juice economy, right? You can start addressing the people side of the equation. So I really do believe that this conversation, and then I think you said this, if you're a business school and this is where you need to be, this is where we're struggling to even understand, is the population ready to be able to address the needs of the future? Because it's going to touch every single industrial domain, every single business domain in a way that it hasn't. But I wanted to give you that business case, and we're trying to replicate that business case across other communities, including having conversations in North Carolina and other states where people are asking, is this the opportunity for me to address people's need by using some of the federal funding, but also help justify the private sector funding?
Thanks, Rahul. I think there's a bunch of questions in the audience, but I wanted to go to Eugene, Fedra, and Laura on a couple of topics that have come up before. So if I can ask Eugene, we talked about charging quite a bit here. It's a bottleneck, there's not enough capacity, you need actually charging infrastructure expensive, but you are making a business of it. How do you do that? And what's your view on charging as a business? I know you do it in commercial setting, but what's your sense of the business in North America and in Europe? How do you make it viable? How are the costs going to be managed? How does it link to the grid? So a series of questions that I think have been raised just now.
Sure. And thank you for plugging me in. I guess I probably would challenge some of the numbers that have been thrown out earlier on by the earlier speakers. Nothing like a good debate. But we won't name the guilty, but somebody said there's an 8-minute dwell time for a gas fill up. We've been operating travel plazas and motorway service areas for 30 odd years, and I can tell you the average dwell time for an ICE customer is 26 minutes. And that's based on millions and millions and millions of transactions. So they don't only buy gas, they go and use the bathroom, or they go and get something to eat. And typically a driver of any kind of a vehicle, if they've been driving for 2, 3, 4 hours, it's their bladder and their stomach that's telling them to stop, not the fuel tank. And they buy the fuel while they're doing that. There is a weird upside of EV charging in that you can multitask, you can plug it in, and you can go and use the bathroom and eat whilst it's charging, whereas you can't do that on the other side of the coin. So just to put that one in perspective, right now, EV drivers do spend an average of 37 minutes on our sites. I'm sorry to bore you with all the statistics, but that's about 11 minutes more. And that's not that the charger couldn't charge the vehicle fast enough. It's that the vehicle today can't take that charge on fast enough. And as technology develops, and David talked about, solid state batteries and whatnot, as the ability of the vehicle to take on that charge quicker, that gap between what an EV driver has to do and what a regular driver has to do will narrow substantially. So I think there is a few myths there. Another point that was made, I think it was Rahul said that BEV sales are in decline. The rate of growth might be in decline, but I think it was 62% from Q3 this year to Q3 last year in the US, growth in BEV. So it's not like somebody's just scared the horses and it's not happening anymore. The rate of growth may have slowed down, and that is potentially due to supply chain issues and maybe some affordability issues and all of that kind of good stuff. So I think it's not quite in terminal decline. Is it hydrogen? Is it EV? Is it hybrid? I think the majority of the market is moving towards battery EVs. I'm not going to say there isn't a place for hydrogen, probably at the upper end of the heavy duty scale. So I think there's lots of reasons why EV thing, or the zero emission vehicle thing, is here to stay and going to grow at various rates depending on what country you're in. Somebody else mentioned, I think, that how many, when you count the number of gas pumps, again, that's what we do for a crust. So we will tell you that right now, EV chargers on our sites in the UK will outnumber gas pumps or petrol pumps. We have typically 50 chargers going in to a new site, taking up to potentially 30% of the parking lot in the UK. So in New Jersey, for instance, we expect EV chargers to outnumber gas pumps on those sites. We run all the turnpike plazas on the New Jersey Turnpike. We expect that in 2028. And it's because the interstate network is maybe only 1 or 2% of the vehicle miles, but 25 or 30% of the vehicle miles traveled. And that's before you even talk about freight and medium and heavy duty and so on, that there is a better bang for buck on an interstate network or a strategic road network. And we're basing our predictions, we talked about data, we're doing this based on 30 years of customer data. What the customer wants. They want a bathroom break. They want some food. They want to fill up the car with whatever the car runs on. It's not a saving the planet argument. The car has to run on some sort of fuel. If you're driving for 2 or 3 hours, you're going to have to stop anyway. If you're driving a last mile delivery vehicle, or even a heavy duty or medium heavy duty vehicle in the US, in certain states, you've got to have 2 half-hour breaks every 13 hours. In the UK, it's a 45-minute break every 4 hours. So the vehicle has to stop. Where the challenge comes in, and I think Chris did hit it on the nail, it's the grid, really. The amount of investment required to get that level of power to that site. So typically, if you take a welcome break motorway service area in the UK, typically it would run off about 0.5 megawatt. We now have an average of about 10 megawatts coming in just for the EV juice. And that's not even counting the heavy duty truck juice. You got to double it or triple it to do that. Because in that half-hour break, that truck does have to get back up and fully charged within half an hour or 40 minutes. But I guess, how do we make money out of this? Our philosophy is, and I should have probably said at the start, we joined the Blackstone family about 2 years ago, 1 trillion assets under management. I'm sure there's lots of people can be familiar with who Blackstone is. So it requires from the private sector an entity with patience and deep pockets, frankly. Most of the concessions that we operate or operations we have are a 20, 25, 30-year concession, which you need that kind of a runway to make that big investment. If you're going to order 10 megawatts of power, it might take 5 years to get to you. It might cost you anywhere between $2 and $20 million to get to you. So you need that ability. And where the public sector comes in is essentially to put pressure on those utility companies to help. And on a more fundamental level, it's not just the capital exposure, it's the operational expense. Demand charges, bone bear in my life, are ridiculous for EV charging. If somebody comes in and hits your peak power for 1 half-hour period in a month, you get nailed. We opened up a site in a state that should remain nameless, but upstate New York. And we sold about $700 worth of green juice, and the energy bill was $12,000 for the same month. So that's not sustainable. Similarly, somewhere like Connecticut, where they have a demand charge mitigation program, it's actually a sustainable business. So there is a long-term view. It's an infrastructure play. You do have to have patience. You do have to have deep pockets. There's all sorts of differences between the US and Europe, and we won't get into that in much, but you have the standardization problem. You have predominantly in Europe, the hose type is CCS. It's all OCPI compliant. It's all OCPP compliant. Whereas in the US, you've got, let's say, 2 technologies fighting for ascendancy. That, let's call it the Tesla hose or the NACS hose versus the CCS hose. As a CPO, a charge point operator, we'll just stick however many hoses is needed on the machine. We don't really care, but it makes for a more complex hardware, software, supply chain environment. So certainly, Europe has some lessons to learn from the US in terms of how they go about doing the subsidy and the grant aiding. And I would say the US is definitely ahead of the posse on that front. But in terms of standardization and open universal networks, Europe is probably ahead. There's definitely going to be a lot of consolidation in the CPO world in Europe because there's just too many. And in the US, there aren't that many, frankly. And if we could figure out a way of working together, that would make life a lot easier. So I think the charging of vehicles on the go, and whereas it might be 6% or thereabouts today, it's due to grow to 20%. So we're not necessarily concerning ourselves with the home charging thing. It's that long-term, long distance journey where predominantly for freight, 30, 40, 50% of freight travels on those interstate or strategic road networks. So we need to have that charging infrastructure, at least on that network. And then perhaps a number of key urban hubs in areas, you know, public parking lots and so on. So there is a bunch of people in the market on the private sector side that are willing to do all this, but they do need government support, predominantly in, I would say, electricity rate reform and in making the utilities, be they state-owned or large private-owned, cooperate in the delivery of the grid to those key sites to get that interstate or strategic road network rolled out.
Thanks, Eugene. Laura, I think we've been talking a lot about data and the lack of an after-sales market model for the future zero-emission vehicle industry. You've been studying this and practicing this for the last 18 plus years, as you said. How do you see the role of data in connecting the infrastructure, connecting the vehicles, and actually making for efficiency as well, which is another question that came up, is not only about batteries, but also efficient transportation as well?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I've really been pleased about in this conversation compared to, what we all were talking about, 5, 10, definitely 18 years ago, is there used to be this sort of magical thinking overlay when we talked about the cost of EVs, whether it be the battery or the balance of systems or whatever else it is. And there was this conversation that, oh, there's this magical pot of money that's going to fall on us. And the magical pot of money was either from vehicle to grid. So the EVs, in theory, would make so much money providing ancillary services to the grid that they would pay for themselves, or the magical pot of money would come from data, because data was the new oil and there'd be data and all of a sudden that would pay for anything, or the magical thinking came from like the battery recycling and the second life. So I'm reflecting all of this. I was so delighted that magical thinking has moved away. And now the conversation is very much about the hard realities of economies of scale and electrical rate reform and all of the things that really need to happen, because I think that the data is critical to enable these things, but the data is not the savior, right? It's a helper. It's not the solution. And that is a real change to where this conversation has been in the past decade, which is delightful. So another interesting trend is we've been talking about, because this is an automaker focused panel, the supply side of the EVs. And I think, as Eugene was starting to get to, there's also a lot of interesting levers on the demand side of the driving itself. So we've been looking at data from millions and millions of different vehicles, and we've been pairing an electric vehicle with a similar ICE vehicle. So looking at a bunch of electric, compact hatchbacks compared to similarly priced ICE compact hatchbacks, and looking to see if we see differences in driving behavior. And the answer is we don't, except for trips over 140 miles, which obviously makes sense. So there's been that's a conversation that I think there's been a lot of assumptions that say it might go the other way, that EVs would be driven differently. And we're seeing very clearly that they aren't being differently. On the other hand, we are seeing significant shifts in how all driving is happening. And I think those shifts, we can't assume that driving will be the same way in our target years 2030, 2040 as they are today. So Eugene was saying 25% of VMT are on interstates, which is true, but that percent is shifting. So what we see because the pandemic proved that demand is not constant, is while VMT overall, I'm speaking from a US perspective, has recovered, the time of day and the time of week when it's happening is different than it was before. And the places in the urban sort of radii are different. It's happening further afield and it's happening more spread out through the day. And that's meaning congestion patterns are different. And we're seeing that trend. Nothing's still stable post-pandemic, but we're not seeing a return to the normal because things have fundamentally changed on the demand side. And another interesting, really, I think even more important trend in demand side is the reduction of young Americans having driver's license, right? We're seeing a decline in private vehicle ownership. So these demand trends can play a huge part in some of these cost equations that we're talking about. So if one shared ride driver has an EV and serves 8 21-year-olds who don't have a driver's license, all of a sudden your cost equation of the transition is quite different. And this is certainly not going to work for all Americans, all Europeans, but for a big chunk of what we're trying to achieve, I think there's some really interesting places to play on the cost side by looking at demand and what shifting demand can do in terms of our assumptions about what it means to own a vehicle or to have a vehicle that exists as a personal asset for personal transportation in America. So I think that's another interesting part of the equation. From an infrastructure perspective, we're seeing a lot of people do a lot of really sophisticated modeling using our data about shifting demand to do really interesting site selection planning. And that's really exciting and cool. And then almost every time they run up smack against these fundamental issues of getting site control and not having interconnection. So I agree with Eugene that I think the smart play in the business, and we are seeing it coming up through our context, the people who are actually building the EV charging stations at scale are often ones who are able to do some sort of generation on site, or for some other reason have a deep interconnection pocket. And I think if we want to accelerate in the US, it has to be about behind the meter generation, because there's no other way to get those fast charging stations fast enough. Because it's not just us that are hammering at the utilities as EV people saying, hey, I need it. Every other green power asset is knocking on their door and demanding change and demanding reviews and demanding a new commission. And so I think, as much as I want it to be about the data for the smartest site selection, and it is a little bit, and I'm happy, so from a business perspective, we're making tons of money helping people do site selection with data-driven site planning. If I were starting a new business, it would be about behind the scenes, behind the meter charging and linking that to EVs and EV charging infrastructure as well.
Thank you, Laura. Joe, I think there's a couple of questions in the room. Do you want to take one or two questions, and then we might go to the Q&A on the chat? Then I think we'll go back to Dave and Fedra as well, and a couple of European questions too. But let's have the audience questions.
Hold on, Laura, that was great.
Thing went away.
I think we lost the mic there.
Try that again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can now.
So Laura, I think what you've just said about customer behavior is really interesting. I would add, what about automated vehicles and robo-taxis? So we're on the same time frame. EVs and AVs are really on the same time frame. Chris Urmson, who started sort of Google's effort in Waymo, I interviewed him in 2013. He thought he'd have automated vehicles by 5 years forward. It's probably going to be 20 years forward. But if we look at the dates, and you're Mary Barra at GM and you bought Cruise Automation, you're looking at a very complex set of investments across EVs and AVs that are really costing you money at almost exactly the same time. But then to Laura's point, what about customer behavior? How many we've got 250 million light vehicles on the roads in the US now. Are we, with robo-taxis, are we going to have 150 million vehicles on the roads? And what does that imply for the infrastructure that we need to build, the battery capability, and all the rest of it? I'd open that up to any of you for your thoughts and observations.
I think we're also in a moment of valley of despair on AVs too. But your point about the time frame still holds. And yes, when that comes true, it will change all of the demand dynamics I'm talking about way more than what we've already talked about.
So what I was going to say in addition to what Laura is saying is we didn't talk about the residual value dictatorship that we have in general, and that is affecting strongly EVs and automated driving functions. I'm not even going to put that in the basket. So when we talk about customer behavior, when we talk about slowing down of demand, we are now seeing the first significant wave of electric vehicles coming into the used car market. And I can't speak for the US, but in Europe, we are seeing a lot of pressure because the residual values are disappointing at this stage. So the effect that is having is, in addition to a slowing economy with the prices of vehicles being higher than the consumer is willing to pay for, now you have also the used car market under significant pressure because residual values are lower than the initial assumptions. So I think the transition is not going to be a transition of one wave of vehicles where we reach 20-30% of penetration of new cars. Is also in the next 25 years, what will we do in this full life cycle management of a vehicle on the field, first-hand, second-hand cars, car sharings, etc., 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 until you get your batteries and you put them behind the meter in a storage container and help the grid. So this full value chain integration, we spoke about the different topics, but if you look at it, this is a marathon. It's a 30-year marathon that the industry is going to go through, from having the right level of handshake between the grid and the charger, all the way to what do you do to recycle and reuse the materials from end-of-life batteries.
But could address your question, and I agree with everything Fedra said. So autonomous and connected, as you saw on my chart, I had a wave going from left to right. The first SAE level 3 that was approved globally but was not deployed in the United States was by Honda about 2 years ago. And Mercedes has one that is now in the US, which is also a SAE level 3. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, started doing connected and autonomous for the benefit of supply chain logistics back in the late 90s. So the tech is there because we can fly and land a plane without necessarily having a pilot touch anything. The complexity on the road has to do with all of the different variables. So to get to SAE level 5, where you would not need, which is a full-scale driving, you need all of the sensors to be connected. You need all of the infrastructure to be instrumented. You need the car. This concept, Laura talked on V2G, the whole V2X. My first autonomous pod that I sat in was in War Tech Center with GM back in the early 2000s. So we can deploy it, but is the infrastructure ready to absorb all of that? So you can either deploy a car that has all of the capabilities. It would be so expensive that only a few people would be able to accept it. Now, you do have big box chains, the Walmarts and others who are testing that capability. Gatik is one that I would ask you to look at. But you need the infrastructure investment, both the public and the private, to be embedded. You need the telecom, you need the edge computing, you need all of the systems to basically operate, and then you need a government agency that says you're ready to now deploy operationally and it's safe and secure to do so. I would say that ball is always going to be 15, 20 years ahead of where you are. But at some point in time, you will have that acceptance, right? So SAE level 3 is there, but at a very high price. The question is, can you commoditize and make it available to everyone? That's effectively how you work the system through a $265 million vehicles. Do you need to wait for all of these to work its way through the snake, or do you start embedding certain things that happen? And I'll just take a point just I love a good debate, Eugene. I did say 8 minutes to 26 minutes, difference between Travel Plaza and a regular mom and pop. And then in the United States, we've got 4 terawatts of production. We need to connect east to west, north to south. We haven't made that investment. And I agree that I think if we're going to talk about a new automotive value chain, which is electrified, what generates and what creates those electrons going to be critical. So I don't think it's a generation issue. I think it's a transmission, distribution, and consumption issue. But I do agree, if you're going to put level 3, you will need generation on site or some kind of capability to do so.
And I think, Rahul, just to maybe add to the comments, one thing we haven't talked about deliberately on the demand side is the role of public transport in balancing the number of vehicles, the type of vehicles, the range of vehicles, and certainly Europe versus the US. I mean, that's a different topic and maybe worth another topic discussion on that itself, right? Joe, you want to take one more question from the audience there?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mike Ryan, and I organize and supervise quite a number of global business experience and global capstone projects here at the business school across a variety of programs. So I first want to say that for a number of years now, our students have been extremely interested in this set of topics. So for example, in the global capstone for the executive MBA, and I might add, basically they get to do pretty much anything they want anywhere in the world. We've been looking at issues of connected vehicles and electric vehicles, and also exactly data issues centered around at the state level. And then also last year, we did a big project on the electric vehicle grid questions and infrastructure questions where we compared the US and Northern Europe. Master of International Business and Policy, same story. We've been looking at some similar kinds of issues for a bunch of years now. And in fact, I've got a guy right now working with GM EV on their global strategy. In Singapore, Global Business Experience Singapore, we've been working with a venture capital firm. So we've worked with a couple of their startups that are related to EV, one related to innovative battery, one toward cleanup of production, and also related to critical mineral mining. We've also worked with Phnom Penh on e-tuk-tuks. We've worked with GM and Hitachi through Singapore. In Global Business Experience MBA in Sao Paulo, we've been partnered for several years now with Embraer Eve, their unit called Eve, which basically is battery or electric helicopters. So I want to say that I think for a bunch of years now, our students have been really, really interested in these questions. And I want to say to Ricardo and Anil, congratulations for organizing this remarkable panel, which was full of great insights. After all of that, here's my question, which is that I would welcome anyone on the panel to offer insights about the innovation and entrepreneurship question, whether that's to talk about startup and the opportunities, whether it's to talk about VC, what the good and the bad might be, corporate VC, or the role of universities and spawning and starting up companies. So welcome any comments about the entrepreneurship story and what you see are the opportunities or the challenges in the years ahead.
I can take that. So I started Streetlight as a tech startup out of my PhD at UC Berkeley. So very much came out of that academia to VC, to more VC, to more VC, to more VC, to finally getting acquired story. I think it's funny, now that I'm on the other side of it, I think that the Silicon Valley has created such a vortex of interest in one specific type of entrepreneurship that I think it's pulled too much of entrepreneurial energy into this high upfront investment, venture capital backed tech growth model. And only some companies and some business models work like that. And I see a lot of good businesses go the VC route and then die because they thought it was the only way to be entrepreneurial. So I think the first thing is, I think it's really important to look at other forms of entrepreneurship besides the Silicon Valley style VC backed model. We were lucky that we ended up in the right financing model for what we did. But I think I want somebody in an MBA program to write some cases about these two spectacular bankruptcies that just happened. One was a formal bankruptcy, one is not. One's called Wejo, one's called Autonomo. So these were both technology startups that were about taking the data that was going to come out of connected cars and creating, literally unicorn valuations, billion-dollar valuations at their initiation, to, really finally find the way that software and automaking all comes together and big data and makes money and money will rain down on us, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of reasons they both collapsed, and this was both in the past 8 months. One was they also collided with the SPAC investment thing, which was just terrible all around. And they, sort of two problems coming together to make these spectacular bankruptcies. But I think that's a real lesson about sort of following buzzwords without staying grounded to fundamental ways that businesses make money. So A, somebody who's a business in the room, please write those case studies because it'll be super interesting. And then B, the most important thing to think about when you're starting this entrepreneurial model, and it sounds simple, but you'd be amazed, most tech startups don't have it for the first 3 years, is who pays you and how much do they pay you and what do they get for the money? And I think that there's been a lot of abstraction away from those fundamentals in my experience of the startup community over the past 10 years. And I think that I think Phaedra was talking about how hard it was for small companies to get capital right now in the consolidation. That is absolutely true. So it may not be the best time to start a tech company right now. I mean, never is the best time, but perhaps not now. But it also points to the companies that have those simple things down. They make money. They actually make profit, which for the past 10 years, most tech companies, we never made a profit before we were acquired, and that was totally fine. My investors, when I talk about profit, would laugh at me. All of a sudden, that has changed, and I think it's come back to a lot of these fundamentals, which I think is a very healthy thing. Because otherwise, you end up with a ton of money. We've been talking about how much money we need. Wejo burned, and this is public information, over $350 million of capital in a few years. That money could have done so much to facilitate some of these fundamentally important green tech things we're talking about.
Thank you, Laura. Hey, Dave Roberts.
Yeah.
Sorry. I have a comment about entrepreneurship. Yeah. If that's okay, Anil. Just a brief comment. Regarding the startups and such, the notion of the automakers, global automakers, Mercedes, BMW, Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, their whole product development system is all about reducing risk and minimizing risk. And they have a 20 to 24 month design cycle. So once you get into series development, the job of the product development engineer is to reduce risk, reject changes, and get things to production. So this launch mentality is really challenging when you start bringing in entrepreneurs and you have some really cool ideas that are coming into the space. And it's a conundrum to say, wow, I really want to bring in this interesting feature that's primarily software, but adds to the value of connected cars or safety or such. But how do I do it in that 24-month development cycle without having blue screens or cars stalling or, filling up assembly plant lots with cars that are not completely built? So that is a conundrum. That's a real difficulty for automakers. They're not very good at embracing that whole discovery, incubation, acceleration that's required of that kind of startup space. And I think they all regret it and they wish they were better at it, but they're not very good at it right now.
Thanks, Alan. I was going to ask Dave the same question, actually. So Dave's in the intersection of these two trends. He's got a couple of startups that are no longer startups. But Dave, what do you see the picture, both with regards to, you built a couple of businesses that are startups, but yet, successful, mature, scaling up. And then to Mike Ryan's question on what should entrepreneurs be thinking of today?
So in terms of going from startup to scale up, that's where most entrepreneurs fall down completely. They don't have the commercialization skills. So if I just talk a little bit about the commercial truck market, we've had a number of high-profile failures in the last 18 months in that space. When you actually, when I talked to Dennis at Arrival, who founded Arrival, Dennis is not an automotive maker, but he had a vision and he managed to persuade Wall Street to part with hundreds of millions of dollars. If I take Volta, very similar story. If I take HGS here, the hydrogen truck company, it's actually founded by a dentist. Now, when I was at Chrysler, if somebody walked into my room and said, "Hey, I'm a dentist and I've got a vision for a new vehicle," it would be about a 20-second conversation before they were escorted off the premises. So although I welcome entrepreneurial skills, I welcome visionary statements, and Elon would probably be our guy, wouldn't he? In a sense, the conflict has always been for me, how do you marry up commercially true automotive skills, reliability, cost, against technology? And they clash so many times. Alan, we talk about, model cycles. The EMA JLR program is a 15-year model cycle. That's a big time to think about. We don't want much change in that 15 years. It costs money, real money in tooling. So we're kind of groomed to be thinking about 10, 15-year cycles in this fast-changing market. And my startups, that thank God have gone on and been successful, we've really thought about, as a board, how do we marry technology with proven automotive skills so you get the best of both worlds? And it's easy to say, really difficult to do. And you've got to be on it every day in terms of not allowing the enthusiasm to get too wild on the entrepreneurial vision, but actually not being so risk averse. You actually just sit there and watch other people get ahead of you. It's a challenge, but it's got to be done. So I would say that the secret of success for startups and entrepreneurs is maybe have some people around you who've got some real commercial expertise. A bunch of young people, terrific. A bunch of young people with no commercial skills, think I know what's going to happen in the next 5 years. You're going to run out of cash. You just don't know it.
Thanks, Dave. I think there's a comment from someone on the panel. Chris, go ahead, please. Sorry, I didn't see you earlier.
No, I appreciate it. I would just highlight, it's a really good question, but I would take it I would scale it up too, because in our conversations with financial houses, we've had many, a lot with them in New York City, a lot in London, and then we also were out in San Jose. And what we're seeing, and it's sort of to one of the questions that were, what are the key long poles in the tent for this industry? Is finance. At the end of the day, is capital, a lot of capital. I mean, Reuters, people talk about billions. This is $1 trillion industry. It's not just billions, it's trillions that's going to be required because of the back of the meter. I mean, the whole entire value chains is humongous in terms of the money that's going to be needed. The unfortunate aspect is a lot of the finance and the financial capitals of the world have moved from an active to a passive portfolio, which means it's yield over growth, which does not help this market, particularly as it relates to 5, 10, 15-year critical mineral mines, if you will, or a 5-year processing facility, or the innovations that's needed from the VCs. What's interesting, though, what we're seeing is, and I'll be honest, is especially in the critical minerals, which is really the foundation for a lot of this, is that, is ESG standards. They don't want to be caught up with a mine that has human rights issues, or they want to call up that's going to have, environmental issues and be, sued, et cetera. So there's a lot of cautious financing out there that needs to be into the growth model, needs to be active and be out there to say, I don't care about our ROI in 5 years. It's okay, 10, 15 years for an ROI. And we're trying to promote that to say we need this investment because governments can't do it alone. The amount of money that's needed to get some of these mines, and I mean, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of mines. People don't even talk about copper. I mean, copper is a huge mineral that needs to be developed. We're hitting a cliff in 2030. And so when we're looking at the VCs and when we go to San Jose, what the unique thing, though, is going on, that has been going on, but it's at an accelerated scale, is the innovation and the entrepreneurship and VC capital going into that. So the good part of that is innovation is moving very, very fast. The bad part of that is how do you invest in the right one? Because can totally change your supply chain. If all of a sudden there's a technology out there, battery chemistry, that completely changes. I don't need that mine. I don't need that mineral. I don't need those minerals. That's hundreds and hundreds of millions and billions of dollars you're putting to the side based on how fast innovation is going on the chemistry side of the things. That's not going to be overnight. It's going to scale in. But you're talking about mines that are opening up tomorrow. That's not going to be putting out production in 10 years from now. And you're putting that, so it's huge risk going into this based on the fact that this VC model of I want it tomorrow, and that innovation is going fast. And exactly to what David's point is, the failure in terms of a lot of this great ideas coming to market is the scaling. Because what's needed is these gigafactories in the hundreds, not just a few, the hundreds. These gigafactories need to be developed to support this industry. And that is 5-6 billion on a gigafactory. I mean, who's got five? Do I have 5, 6? That's one. We need 100. So it just goes to the notion of how much finance is going to be needed in this market from your institutional, from your pension funds, from government financing and incentives and tax incentives to VCs. And all of that needs to play a role in this to keep this market going. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Rahul, I think we perhaps need to wrap up now.
Yeah,
That's okay?
Can I just
30 seconds, 30
Quick.
seconds.
So what is the purpose? What is the business case? We're working with several startups. And if you can show a 3 to 5 year pipeline that gives you operational projects, somebody will fund and finance you. So I 100% agree with Laura. There are MBA students who are writing a business case that you can put the sustainable mobility, the equity, you can put together a business at scale. Yes, there is funding for that, but it is not the 15-year play that David mentioned. That's not going to fly anymore.
Thanks, Rahul. So I know we have like 60 seconds left before we wrap up on time today. So first of all, thanks to everyone for both attending. Big applause for the panelists. Clearly, this was a difficult panel in the sense we kind of looked at the overview of the whole set of issues in the industry in a way. And Mike, I think you raised a question, which is I think the trigger for how we take this forward. So clearly, this was a starting point in terms of looking at global value chains in this industry in particular, a big one. 20% of all emissions are auto transport related or maybe more. And so I think we started off well in terms of identifying a sector that is off, front, left, and center. What next? I think we have several inputs from the speakers today. We have several inputs from the audience, both online and in the room that we didn't necessarily answer. So a whole bunch of unanswered questions that we, I think, intend to take into a follow-on discussion in the next couple of months. Combination of, we'll write a white paper. We'll outline some working group topics. We'll perhaps organize another roundtable or two in the next few months as well. And clearly get a little deeper into some of the topics. And there are questions raised on trade, on battery life, on commercial transport, on the role of trade financing that came in the Q&A. And I think David Etzweiler's point about where are the people to do all of this, all critical questions. So I think we scanned the surface today, which was, I think, partly the goal. And I want to thank everyone once again. And you'll all receive emails from Joe Fear and our team on some of the materials today and some of the follow-ups as well. But with that, big applause to the online speakers as well as the audience, as well as Dave, Chris, and Rahul in the room. And thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye now.